The tall poppy syndrome. I have now something scary to share with you. The majority of the literature recommends that a full-time coaching team with extensive funding and managerial support be created. This is normally closely linked with that enterprise transition team, suggested by Schwaber in his Enterprise and Scrum. Now here's the bad news. All coaching teams in every agile implementation I have seen have been destroyed. Coaches build enemies in an organization. As a full-time change agent, it's hard to do anything less, as you constantly stick your head above the parapet and stand like the tall poppy amongst the fields of shorter ones. Now, I've heard Joseph Pelrine refer to this as tall mushroom syndrome. The idea is the tall poppy or mushroom gets cut off. Often the organizational politics wins in the end. This does not mean your transformation has to fail. It just means be aware that you must not put all your eggs in one basket and do not purely rely on one coaching team. Though make sure you do have one. Often this process is accelerated by the change agents not being appropriately valued and a sort of shoot the messenger culture existing in the organization. We must be wary of that. Interestingly, in many of the early adopters of Agile, 2002 to 2007, well, a lot of those original coaches and consultants left to take advantage of further opportunities in other companies for a variety of reasons. Money, respect, power, money. As Agile has become more mainstream, that potential risk has lessened, but it is still there. So we must, and this is what John Kotter recommends, invest in our change agents, whether they are short-term, external coaches, trainers and consultants, more medium-term, the professional coaches we hire or the internal coaching team, or more long-term, senior leadership and the Scrum Master community. Gerald Weiberg's law on strawberry jam. The wider you spread it, the thinner it gets. You will never have enough coaches. They will be spread too thin. Now, there are some tactics and a couple of big strategies we can put into place to help mitigate this issue. The first is pair coaching. So this photo over my shoulder is of two Argentinian footballers, Ricky Villa and Ozzy Ardiles, from the late 70s and early 80s. These were two fantastically skilled players brought to England to play for the top division side, Tottenham Hotspur. Now, a lot of English football clubs signed players from South America, wanted to take advantage of the seemingly better footballing talent available there. Now, England has some terrible weather. I'm sorry, but we do. Rain and misery. And some of our more northern towns can seem a little, how do I say this, overcast, grey, miserable. Even somewhere like London can be a big cultural challenge for a young man arriving from overseas. So what happens? Often these footballers do not settle. This is reflected in their play, i.e. badly, and they end up going back home with their careers dented and lots of money and potential wasted for the football club, the player and the fans. So one way for teams to help mitigate this is to buy two players from the same country. The idea being a little bit misery loves company, and they can help reduce homesickness and support each other. This pattern applies rather nicely to coaching. Full-time coaching in a large organization can be very dispiriting. You do not have the financial rewards an external echidna coach may have. The more days you work, the more you get paid. Instead, as a salaried employee, it can be very hard to face the constant travel, the ever-changing colleagues and scenery. This is why it is a good idea to pair coaches. It lightens the workload slightly, gives companies in those environments when you're working away, and generally makes the pace a lot more sustainable. We must always practice what we preach. How will teams adopt sensible, sustainable working practices if they see major change agents in their organization performing heroics? It will take us back to the longer hour, reduced quality situation we're trying to get out of. You will also find more stickability in your employee coaches when they're on site and a deeper engagement with such a model. Otherwise, the coach can continuously be looking to disengage as early as possible. One final thing, we can also use this as a way to build knowledge and skill in the coaches. We can pair these expensive external consultants with our own internal staff and grow our own ability, while simultaneously transforming our world of work. Gorilla Monsoon and Jesse the Body Ventura. As a teenager, I was rather fond of the American wrestling craze that spread across Europe in the late 80s and the early 90s. Now, if you're unaware of professional wrestling, it involved two men, and now women, pretending to fight each other in a staged bout. Now, normally these men, and now women, are overly tanned, oiled and muscled, and act and dress like superheroes and supervillains. Now, two of the commentators of these matches was Gorilla Monsoon and Jesse the Body Ventura. How they commentated was very interesting, and they used a very famous wrestling gimmick, and that's a wrestling term for a pattern. One of them would do the play-by-play, describing the match, selling the action as real, making sure people understood what was going on in this fake bout. And the other would colour commentate, i.e. express emotions about the event, discuss motivations, mindset, add colour, action, vitality to the story being told by the play-by-play man. Interestingly, this colour commentator and play-by-play did not always agree. Jesse, the Body Ventura, for instance, was what they call a heel, a bad guy. So he would always express support and admiration for the villain. Now, this seemingly contradictory nature did not affect the performance, however. It just added depth to the characterization of the bad guys, who could seem rather like a cipher otherwise, and could add some rounding to the paper-thin good guy characterization. So why am I telling you about this? Well, this pattern works very effectively combined with the Argentinian footballers pattern I mentioned before. This pairing of coaching, especially in a workshop or training session, can allow one of them to focus on the play-by-play, the facilitation technique, the training content, and the other can add colour and more strategic high-level thinking around the why of the subject. It is very easy when training, for instance, for a coach to be drawn into a very low level tactical, what does Scrum do in this situation, and often miss the context of the big picture. Correspondingly, people want some meat on the bones. They don't want the conversation to continuously go back to the big picture and the principles if they're trying to work out how they're going to apply certain techniques practically. So applying a paired approach can help this and give a fuller response to the needs of your colleagues. For me, I pair very effectively with Paul Goddard, a fellow UK Scrum trainer and a colleague of mine. So well we can naturally interchange between these roles. If you are working with a less well-formed relationship, then maybe being intentionally aware of this pattern and following it may also give you significant help and stop the coaches stepping on each other's toes. Do you know, consistency of content is less important than consistency of intent. Even though these two commentators disagreed about certain aspects, they both understood their job was to make the match seem as good as possible. As with pair programming, you may get the argument that it's twice the price. But as with pair programming, if we can reduce the amount of defects or errors produced, that will save us money and time in the long term and increase the stickiness of the change. We can also use this to build apprentice coaches, bringing up and building a coaching community of practice in the teams themselves or around the teams themselves, slightly thickening that proverbial jam. Part-time coaches, the questionnaire question. The second failure of this jam approach was the cultivation of part-time coaches. In one company I worked with, we used a volunteer system for these coaches. We looked for interested people and gave them some of the skills and tools they needed to become a coach to their part of the organisation. One thing was missing from this. I call this the questionnaire question. Now, if you go to a shopping mall in any medium-sized town or shopping park, you will find a few people hanging around in the main auditorium. They are smartly dressed and have a clipboard, and they'd like to ask you a few questions. Normally, it is doing some sort of product research, and they're trying to find out what the general public thinks of their product, service, and/or brand. Now, there is a big risk with this approach. They always seem to be out in the middle of the workday, at 3 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon. The people wandering the mall at 3 p.m. on a Wednesday are not fully representative of the general public. They are the people who are not only out and about at this time of day, but also willing to take a survey. The pool of group people shrinks again. Now, unless you have very disciplined questioners with a strong understanding of who they're looking for and why, you could end up with some very skewed surveys. And this is exactly what I saw. We looked for volunteers and we didn't filter them. The more the merrier. Thus, we ended up with a part-time or apprentice coaching community that self-selected themselves for this job for a variety of reasons. Now, some stepped forward because they had no other job. Their old role was being made redundant in the organisation, and they were literally looking for a life raft to cling to save their career. These are what I would call the survivors. Completely understandable behaviour. I would do the same thing, but their skill set did not often match what was needed. The second was what I call the enthusiastic amateur. These colleagues were enthused and excited by the training they had attended and the coaching they had received, and they emerged as newly converted agile zealots, wanting to throw themselves into the fray. Alas, with the limited knowledge and in some cases ability, these individuals struggled. They were frequently more dangerous than helpful, both to themselves and their own careers, and they often sullied the name of the change with their semi-amateur approach. The gaps in knowledge in this community was quite shocking at times. A user story that took 2 pages of A4 because obviously it won't fit on the cards was amongst some of the things we heard. Now, in amongst those amateurs and survivors were people who generally got it. I call these the real deal. People with the right skills or the ability to learn, the ability to actually coach and understood the world of Agile. Sometimes they understood on an instinctual level, and sometimes they understood through the learning they had. These were invaluable, but far, far too rare. They were often hoarded by the teams they worked with on a day-to-day basis and just didn't have enough time to share around the rest of the organisation. The final type was worse again. The crony. Often selected or suggested by senior management of their particular area of the business. The crony is the individual who stands for the man rather than what needs to be done. Often a perpetrator of the status quo. Always a politician. These people play games and manipulate the system. Scrum and Agile as a whole to achieve their own and masters' personal objectives. Now, in the larger organisations, these people will ooze out of the shadows and will be a major factor to deal with. There was a large range of variance in all these people, and the lack of filtering by anyone caused us problems. Effectively, it was dropping quality to get more. A fundamental break in the Agile principles, but something even some of the major thought leaders of Scrum have done for their own reasons. The real deal we need to focus on in the organisation. We will need to draw an appropriate team together. And all this leads us into our second major strategy, Scrum Masters. Oh, one last thing, last little anti-pattern for you. I have seen again and again the problem was approached in completely the wrong fashion. As good Agile teams know, if you have too much work in progress, if you have too much work needed to be delivered, and if you don't focus on business value, you can get into trouble. We need to work one thing at a time, not in parallel. We need to reduce the work in progress, and you don't cut quality to achieve more. You define done, you build in vertical slices, and stop when you've achieved what you need to do from a business and technical perspective. Now, the cutting corners to get more done is what occurs if you take a jam approach to your change program. This one organisation I work with approached the problem like consultants, not like change agents. We spread the coaches too thin and they just became trainers running through slide decks. What I'll show you now in this graphic is a more appropriate strategy. What should be done is a concentration on vertical slices of the organisation, working with a finite end-to-end area and enable them to achieve agility through strong Scrum and stronger engineering practices. Once they are done to the right level of quality, then we'll move forward to the next area, the next slice, the next part of the organisation. This change in approach from vertical slices to a jam approach caused the agilification of the organisation to be very superficial and high level rather than embedded, deep and culture based. You know what? We made some lovely videos and some training courses, but not enough to induce in-depth change. What we need to do is not like spreading jam, but like cutting a slice of bread.